I'll just let you know, this is not on our agenda now. I wanted to see if there were any modifications or anything that counselors wanted to make. I'll send this to law, get it on the next one, and hopefully the 22nd we'll be voting on it, so.
And with that, we're going to have Susan Lerner from Common Cause come and give us a quick overview of redistricting. Baby.
Thank you, counselors, for the opportunity to meet with you today. I'm Susan Lerner. I'm the executive.
Can you hold on one second, Susan? For everybody that's leaving the chambers, can you guys leave quietly, please, so we can continue with our business? Thank you, guys in the corner. Thank you.
We can get you a police escort.
All right, go ahead. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. Again, I'm Susan Lerner. I'm the executive director of Common Cause New York, which is a good government group that works for a strong and vibrant democracy throughout our state. And I want to thank you for the invitation to speak with you today about independent redistricting. I did bring a bit of a presentation. It has more detail than I am planning to actually cover, but I will leave it with you. Redistricting, as you probably know, is the process of redrawing the political district lines that happens every 10 years after the census.
Right. I'm gonna go, but I actually have an issue with this. Was this a publicly advertised meeting?
Well, actually, it wasn't publicly advertised, but you had received the email on March 5th.
Yeah, okay.
And you never responded to the email.
Okay.
Thank you. So redistricting happens every 10 years after we receive the information from the census. And as you know, the census is happening next year. It usually takes about a year until the information comes down, and we expect to see the new census data in sometime in the middle of 2021, at which point the city then has the opportunity to redraw its political boundary lines to be sure that the boundaries reflect the actual changes in population so that the districts are more or less equal in size. There are various different ways in which jurisdictions handle their redistricting. Currently, there are independent commissions which are being set up across the country. There are political commissions. There are processes for nonpartisan state staff, and there are now a movement to provide constitutional standards. And of course, there is the procedure which you have, which is that you draw your own lines. But there is definitely a movement to reform redistricting and have a independent process rather than the people who are most affected by the placement of the district lines drawing their own district lines. Redistricting is a very hot topic right now across the country. Some of you may have seen that there was an argument in front of the U.S. Supreme Court last week. Common Cause was the plaintiff in that particular lawsuit, which attacks partisan gerrymandering in the state of North Carolina, an egregious Republican gerrymander. But we also have been participating through one of our members who brought a lawsuit in Delaware attacking an egregious Democratic gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is not a partisan issue. It is an issue which all voters care about, and what we have seen, the polling shows very popular across the political spectrum, the idea that the process of drawing maps should be fair and should reflect the actual population changes and not advantage one or another political party or any particular elected official. What we've seen also is a wave of redistricting that is taken up at the local level. California has been the leader there. So in 2008, there were 2 cities in California which had independent redistricting commissions. Now we've got 14, with Long Beach being the most recent one, and also Austin, Texas has an independent redistricting commission. If Syracuse were to take up this issue and to propose an independent redistricting commission, Syracuse would be the first city east of the Mississippi to adopt this very popular reform. New York City has a redistricting commission, but is not independent. It is appointed directly by the mayor and the city council. So why would you want to adopt a local commission? First of all, it depoliticizes redistricting. It increases public engagement and transparency. It improves community representation, and it can also, when properly done, improve minority representation. And we've got some examples from California cities that show its impact on often traditionally marginalized communities. Your current process, as I mentioned, is one where you draw your own lines. There is a very definite move away from that particular process. And so we believe that the key elements of a good redistricting process at the local level are to have an independent authority, an independent commission, rather than an advisory commission, which is what we have in New York City. That fairness is built into the process. The commissioners are independent and impartial, that they represent the diversity of Syracuse, and that there is neighborhood and community-centric redistricting criteria. Strong transparency and public participation is very important. And I do want to point out that we have seen a wave of citizen-driven redistricting initiatives at the state level. And in 2018, we had 5 different initiatives in a variety of states to set up redistricting reform. All of them passed. And they run the gamut from Colorado to Utah to Michigan to Ohio. So as I said, this is an issue which is getting a lot of attention from the public and lawmakers across the country. So what would be involved if you decided that you wanted to take up planning an independent redistricting process for Syracuse? You would be looking at what values you wanted your reform to reflect, discussing how would you be sure that the process is fair, how it would guarantee equal representation, what kind of transparency measures would you build in, how would you ensure racial equity, and that it would reflect the diversity of the city. You would need to think about who are the key stakeholders who you would want to participate in the planning process. Obviously yourselves as council members, but community groups, good government organizations like Common Cause New York, the League of Women Voters, Syracuse Focus, are all stakeholders that I think that you would want to involve. And I think that you would probably want to consider a process that directly involves the public. And there are various ways in which you can do that. Informational forums. Good government groups like Common Cause and others are happy to work at the neighborhood level to set up information forums, to work with you at hearings where the public is informed about the mapping process and what kind of choices you would make in reforming your process. We also can help lead mapping workshops. It's really interesting to work with communities to have them visualize what are the important places in our community. Where do we shop? Where do we worship? Where do we go to school? Where are our recreation centers? It is actually really enlightening for map makers to hear directly from the public how they themselves conceive of their communities. And we believe that that is the most essential aspect of having an independent and fair process, is understanding how the community conceives of itself. And of course, there would be the process of council hearings, expert testimony. We would be able to assist, and I'm sure others would, in identifying experts, academic and practical. We would want to help bring in commission members from other jurisdictions who've had the experience of drawing the maps to help you understand the pros and cons of the process and how it actually works, and for you to see directly the kind of impartiality that you can set up on a properly constituted commission. And of course, you would want to hear from members of the public. So I'm delighted to be here today. I'm excited that you are interested in considering this kind of reform, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions. And of course, the resources of my organization as a leader in fair redistricting across the country are at your disposal.
Thank you, Susan. Anybody have any questions?
Where, you said that we would be the first city east of the Mississippi.
That's correct.
Where are you doing it now? Where are you now active?
You mean where do we have it set up? So there are 12 cities in California. There is Austin, Texas, and most of the action in the last several years has been at the state level. So it's exciting to think about it here in New York at the municipal level, because this would be such a, I think, salutary and unique reform for our state. And it would be a model for our state in showing how you could set up an independent commission, just as a general proposition, both at the municipal level and the state level.
Yeah. Question for a bit of a devil's advocate question.
Sure.
There's always the skepticism when you talk about bipartisanship, right? And some probably some not too far from here, in terms of where they work, may make the argument that even persons on independent commissions have a party affiliation.
Some do, some don't.
Right. And so the point of that argument, which I've heard from some people before, would be that in that there's still the concern with partisan type of thinking. I mean, what has been your experience with that?
So our experience has been that a properly set up selection process really brings out people who want to be commission members from a very neutral point of view. Our experience in Austin, our experience in Sacramento, California, our experience in Arizona and in California is that it attracts people who are civically minded. Last election cycle, last redistricting cycle, was the first time that we had an independent redistricting commission in California. And they have a multi-step process where they first solicit members of the public to go on a website and answer a baseline 6 questions. When that was first set up, we thought, we're going to do really well if we get 5,000 or 6,000 Californians who are interested in this pretty wonky and relatively rigorous civic exercise. More than 30,000 people went on the website and answered the questions. And they then were winnowed down based on those initial questions. There was a set of questionnaires, and the people who were ultimately chosen were not people who had been tremendously politically active previously, but they have been civically active. They reflected the diversity of California. They reflected the geographic range of California. And they did a tremendous job in terms of going out and listening to the public, coming up with an initial set of maps, and then taking those maps on the road and hearing from people in the community, well, that's an interesting way to draw our district, but you haven't thought about this particular community that isn't so obvious, that is a immigrant community in this farm area. You've cut it in half, don't cut it in half. And they were able to change it based on the input from the public. So what we've seen is that it actually works not as a political exercise, but exactly the opposite, a civic exercise. And frankly, from my perspective, as somebody who goes to a lot of cities across New York, I have been impressed with the kind of civic culture that you have here in Syracuse. You have some institutions that I think would definitely be up to helping lead this kind of discussion, and people who would be interested in being involved not from a political standpoint, but from a civic engagement and fairness standpoint.
I appreciate, in particular, the last statement in regards to it being more of a civic process, which I can agree is a more respectable approach. I got one more devil's advocate thing before I mention 2 other things in short. And a climate that's been in existence now for a short while, and this is a climate I think a climate that many are unaware of. There's been this kind of slow maneuvering on the part of partisanship,
Yes.
and state legislatures that led to what I argue is a stripping of power from legislators, city legislators around the state in particular. And you're going to come into the concern that some councilors have that this is one more power that the council have that it would essentially agree to give away. We were in the discussion earlier when I said this body and probably similar bodies are probably 2 steps from merely being hood ornaments. Who power they've given away over time, and I'll be glad to name those agencies, but I don't want to put them on the spot, that I think were just very intelligent political maneuvering to remove the people away from the legislative process. Obviously the benefit here is there's an effort to kind of get them more involved, and so I get that. But I guess I wanted to kind of put that on the table, that's a concern, for what I think, even before any of us got here, an abused legislative body, that, again, is being asked to surrender one more power.
So I think that there are 2 areas that in some situations are considered to be within the body's power, which create inherent conflicts of interest. And that is setting your own salary and setting your own political boundaries. So I see that as very, very different than a situation where you would be ceding an approval process or a budgeting process to an appointed agency or to some other level of government. The public sees this, rightly or wrongly, and I believe, unfortunately, often rightly, as a conflict of interest, in the same way that most salary determinations don't allow you to give yourself a raise. There has to be some distance in the future. The public sees bodies that draw their own lines as inherently favoring incumbents and favoring themselves. And it distances the people from their elected representatives in a way that we don't think is beneficial to either the elected representatives or the people. So I absolutely agree in terms of the idea that we need to have powerful, effective, vigorous legislative processes for all legislative bodies, and that's something we at Common Cause are fighting for in Albany. But there are a very few areas, as I said, 2, where I think it is appropriate for the legislative body to step aside and to have independent citizens make that determination.
Well, maybe we need to step aside on the discussion of our pay because it's horrible. We certainly need to get ourselves raised.
I want to step into that conversation.
Right.
We could have another.
Well, we helped New York City get council get a raise, and the state.
Let me point this out, though. One benefit I immediately see, and this may be a bit to the discredit of the last statement, is that there are so many people, regardless of the neighborhood they live in, who are clueless about the process here in City Hall. They're clueless about what our job is, with all due respect. And they believe that our job is more in the direction of human services, social services, as opposed to legislative, fiscal, so on and so forth. And so this serves, I think, a great opportunity to further empower people with understanding of the tools they have at their disposal, and on top of enlightening them about what it means to have equitable representation, in election districts. So I think that's one benefit. The other benefit to me is to deal with the cracking and packing, which
Yes.
certainly happened here and happened in the last redistricting process. The Democratic Party back after the 2010 census, and the commissioner can correct me if I'm wrong, sought legal action against what we saw to be gerrymandering on the part of the county ledge. And I'll describe one district and then I'll be quiet. Fortunately, this district is, I won't be partisan here. But what I will say is you have one district that stretches from Geddes to the 15th Ward, which is just past the hospitals, which include a housing project. And the likelihood, with all due respect, regardless of party affiliation, that person has frequented that area is none.
So one advantage to taking up this issue at the city level is, yes, you're educating the public, and I think you also are helping to initiate a countywide discussion as well. Because once the public, to me, I think it's very significant that we see a cluster of cities in California, because there's a domino effect. Once the public wakes up and sees the town next door, the city next door is doing this better. Why don't we do it better? Once that public discussion begins to take off, it spreads. And that's why we're excited to work with you on this possibility, because we think Syracuse would be a model for the surrounding county. It can be a model for other cities, and it can be a model for the state.
Anything else?
Yeah, I have some questions.
Sure.
So, if we get like into the weeds on what actually constitutes good districting, that seems kind of intangible at the moment to me. Like, I know what bad maps look like.
Yeah.
We see those all the time. But, you know, what if we just, let's say we looked at a map of Syracuse, just went, you know, like a pizza pie, we cut it 6 ways. Why would that be bad? What are the actual criteria for what's fair? Because I think fair is always a relative term per se.
Absolutely.
So what do we want to go, you know, you mentioned racial equity. Do we want to look at, you know, do we want the same racial breakup in each district? I mean, what are the more criteria when you dig into it? Of
So
what
it
fairness
gets,
looks like? Yeah.
it does get pretty detailed. The advantage is you're not starting from a blank page. We've got great models. We've got a really good model in Austin. A good model is Sacramento, California. We have the state models. And there's been a lot of discussion among legal scholars and among advocates and lawyers as to how you set up that set of criteria. So Florida doesn't have an independent commission, unfortunately, but what they did adopt through their ballot is a set of criteria that guides the map makers. We at Common Cause in the last redistricting cycle actually drew a set of reform maps to answer exactly that question, which is, what are the criteria we should use? And if you use the criteria, what does that mean on the ground? And what I learned is that how you order the criteria, which has priority, will change your map. But there is a basic set of criteria that would be shared with you, that you then would be able to determine whether these were the appropriate criteria for Syracuse and what order you wanted to take them up. There are some legal requirements under the Voting Rights Act regarding racial equity. There is the Supreme Court requirement that the districts have to be more or less equal in population. But one thing that's very interesting is where you place what we call compactness in your set of priorities is going to change your map a lot. If you prioritize reflecting communities of interest over compactness, your map might not look like a well-divided pizza pie, but it'll reflect how people actually live and work on the ground. The problem with just taking your map and programming a computer for straight lines is that people don't live in straight lines. People cluster in different ways. So the process is trying to reflect on the maps an honest, impartial, fair version of keeping people who have common interests together in one district. And as the counselor pointed out, what happens in gerrymandering is packing, right? So you take the people of a particular ethnicity or the people of a particular political party, you pack them into one district where they have a supermajority, and they then aren't able to elect enough people in the legislative body to actually reflect anything close to their percentage in the population. Or another way that gerrymandering happens is to take that same community and splinter it between 8 different districts so that those people can't exercise a common political will, and they aren't really, their needs aren't really reflected by the body. So you would not be starting from a blank page. We have been working on this. We've been refining it through lawsuits and working with academics and advocates across the country with a set of suggestions for the kinds of considerations. Actually, my colleagues in California have a very detailed website that weighs these various different values and considerations and actually generates model legislative language for you. So you would be coming in at a time when there's been a lot of thinking and tools that help you tailor whatever proposal, if you do decide to adopt one, that reflects your concerns here in Syracuse and not just something off the shelf from some other city or some other state. So the resources are out there to help you.
Great. And then my other question was, so we're talking about 2021, right? You said after the census.
Correct.
So what would it look like if we were to say, get enthusiastic about this and want to be, as you said, one of the first east of the Mississippi to implement this? What does the road forward look like? What does the map look like? What are our next steps?
So-
and what are the steps proceeding, if you could give us some
Right.
broad strokes?
So currently, your redistricting process is set forth in your city charter. So what we would be talking about would be an amendment to the charter, which of course has to go on the ballot. If it went on the ballot this November, and assuming that the voters liked your proposal, you would have adequate time to actually work out the details of the commission and have it set up in a way that would be ready for the census data coming down in mid-2021.
One quick question. So when you say it would be a ballot initiative, would that be at the city, county, or state level?
City level,
City
to,
level.
to amend your city charter. The process that you have, which I believe is you place a referendum on the ballot. You decide the language of the referendum, and then the voters go yay or nay, think it's a good idea or don't think it's a good idea. And of course, I know Common Cause, and I am sure various civically minded groups here would be interested in engaging in the process of working out with you what it would look like, and certainly helping to educate the public. Because, as I said, this is an area where we found that voters and citizens, just residents, are extremely interested once they see the map as it exists. People tend to get irritated and they want to know, what can we do to make this better? It's pretty graphic. It's very visual. You've got a bad map. In some parts of your county, I understand, that is very gerrymandered, and I think there's a clear argument that the voters would understand why the system should be changed, and then it's up to all of us to design a system that they would have trust in.
I see an inherent conflict between the concern about packing, where people of a particular political persuasion or ethnic group are packed with a purpose of limiting their political will. But I see a conflict with that concern and the concern about wanting to group people in their natural communities. Right? Because if we want to group people who are working, living, shopping, recreating in the same groups, how do you navigate that inherent conflict?
So, there's no perfect version. It really is trying to reflect. I was having a conversation with somebody earlier today. In our reform maps for congressional districts in the last cycle, which were adopted by a federal court and had a heavy influence on our current congressional maps, we made a value judgment at Common Cause where we thought that keeping cities together as a single congressional district reflected the community of interest. There's a difference of opinion. There were others who felt that the city is better represented by having more than one representative in Congress, and that there should have been 2 Buffalo representatives, 2 Rochester representatives. That, I think, is where the public process comes in, right? And also when it's pretty obvious, packing is so obvious. It's so such a overpopulation that it's very different from reflecting communities of interest.
Anyone else? No?
Have you ever seen communities where one entity does it and then another entity piles on? That a region, it becomes like a regional thing?
No, I'm not sure I know what you mean.
For example, the California, you said there was 12 cities. If it takes up in one city, or does it then spread out regionally?
It does. It does.
Is that what you were saying, Tim?
The cities, cities see it as a good idea, and other cities pick it up. So yes, we do see it.
I mean the obvious thing, like we do it and then all of a sudden maybe the county would do it or other levels of government do it.
So we haven't seen it spread as much from the city to the county level in California. I'm not sure why. We jumped right up to the state level there. But there's nothing that prevents the county from taking a good idea once they see it working well in the city. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan.
I know, but